All right, so welcome to this quick video on desktop publishing basics. It's a kind of an important thing to take a look at. What we'll do today is think about what desktop publishing actually is and essentially what the terminology will be that we can be using as we're going through and getting a better understanding of desktop publishing. So if we think about it, historically, desktop publishing is the creation of documents that are using specific page layout software in order to share print information. However, obviously, with the advent of such extensive online work, we now know that if we combine technology with software and either have a laser printer or get a URL to publish it online somewhere, then that is all desktop publishing. As we go through today, there is this glossary of terms that essentially gives a tremendous amount of in-depth information for desktop publishing. This course is not obviously specific into desktop publishing, so we will take a look at some of this terminology, but then also understand that it's not to that depth and extent. So let's get back to our PowerPoint here. And essentially, we know that desktop publishing is used through a variety of different software. For our purposes, most likely Microsoft Office, Google Docs will probably be used. If you have Adobe background, you most certainly can use InDesign. I have a link here with apps, just quick to Wikipedia. And you can see they've got it listed here, desktop publishing software for Windows, a variety of different programs for Mac, and then also online desktop publishing software. So I reference this because as you're going through this, you may think about a lesson you want to share with your students to have them get involved with desktop publishing. So here are some online options, as well as then also Google Drive, obviously, and then our desktop softwares that are available. All right, so when we think about that, obviously we want to know and understand page orientation, the two different layouts, whether we have a portrait or landscape, portrait being, our vertical, landscape being the horizontal to have more width of information. When we talk about arrangement or column structure, it's very important here to think about how we are presenting the information. Traditionally, we see flush left. There are times when you'll see flush right, but it would most likely not be utilized for our purposes in desktop publishing. I think we see that most often when we're doing specific alignment for our syllabi, or excuse me, our resumes or curriculum vitae. Justified, that's when it's all centered with equal edges, and that is something you may use in desktop publishing. Centered font you want to use in a limited manner with desktop publishing, but it can be a great way to have a specific call out of an individual piece of your page. Carrying on with that, then, a lot of different information regarding the text type. We'll look at those two different types and discuss when and how they should be used. There is very specific information for display type, the headings, our left margin, obviously, bottom margin, pretty evident there at the bottom of the page, and then clearly the right margin and top margin. And then if we think about column width, those are things that are important to discuss and understand depending on the amount of content you have on the page, as well as thinking about how we're indenting. We'll talk about all of these different aspects, And then the gutter, the space here down that you can see in the bottom, that is, the gutter is referencing the space between the two columns if you have different columns on your page. And our runaround or text wrap are things that we will think about as we move forward with our word processing basics. So from there, this is really important. It seems to be something that I see occasionally. Always only have one space between sentences. So there have been times, I guess, in the past when students have been taught to double space after the sentence. That is not what we want to do in desktop publishing or APA format for that matter. It is a single space between sentences in all of our written documents. The two different type fonts are our serif type, which is the ones with, I was always lovingly told, the hands and feet that come off of the edges of the typeface. Serif is used for your content on the page. It is the aspect of the type of font that you would use in the columns. Now I want to specify here, because you'll hear differently as you think about web design. When things are published online, quite often the thought process has been historically that serif font should be avoided for online pieces. So as you're moving forward into desktop publishing and then thinking about taking it into a web space or a URL, you want to lean more towards sans serif font. However, that even becomes a little blurred as the resolution of display becomes stronger and stronger. You will see all of these ideas merged. So the historic primary concept for our purpose in print resumes, in that type of document, you will use serif typeface for the column content, and then two sans serif will be used in the headings. And this is our sans serif used for the display headings. Serif is used, as I said, for the text. When you're doing your columns and changing the alignment, it's really important to set tabs, and there will be information as we move forward on how to do that tab setting. But using the tab button to make sure that everything is aligned perfectly is really important when you go with desktop publishing. Spell check, spell check, spell check, spell check, please spell check. I always can tell whether or not a student has run their document through spell check just with a quick glance with the typos that come through, right? Because it's not really always about, do I know how to spell it correctly or not? As we're typing and get more proficient and type faster, typos just happen. So please use spell check. Principles for the text and display, let's take a look at some of those. For your text type, you're going to use 10 to 12 point serif font. So anywhere in between those two, and use your discretion in deciding between 10 to 12 point based on how much text is actually on the page. This is kind of easily understood as you look at it, but you don't want to use all caps. For the most part, all caps are avoided, but most specifically with decorative typefaces. And when you're thinking about trying to grab people's attention, you know, you want to, quite often people try to throw in different variety. Obviously, we're not going to do this though, right? That total mix of different typefaces just does not work. You want to use accent type very sparingly. Yes, there are times when you'll use bold font, but as we say here, you know, if everything is bold, then nothing is bold. So you want to use that very sparingly. Make sure that you have just a word or two that you really want to draw the attention to as you're going through. Using caps, bold, or italics for blocks, you know, you're not going to do anything that looks like this, obviously. You want to make sure that you can have that variety of font without making it so evident. When you're using reverse font, and just to kind of step back for a minute and explain what you most likely do already understand, reverse font is simply when you have a light colored typeface set against a dark background. So when you're doing that, if you want a black background with white font, for example, that's the most graphic, you will use a thick sans serif font. And you can see here in this example, the sans serif font is much more easy to read and distinguish on the black darker background than is that serif font. So always use a thicker sans serif if you're going to do a reverse font. We've talked about this a little bit. You're going to use all caps sparingly. It can be used as call out for headings or titles, but they should not be used a great deal. You're going to separate paragraphs with either indents or spaces. And in this situation with desktop publishing, either of those two options is acceptable. You can do that based on your personal preference, but you do want to make sure that you continue the same style throughout your entire document. So if you're separating with indents, that's fine. That is APA format. If you're separating with space, that's also fine. APA format does not necessarily apply to desktop publishing. I'm just letting you know that for future reference. So anyhow, either separate with indents or spaces. Breaking up text with headings and subheadings, that's a very important way to specify as you move from your resume assignment to the learning theories document you'll be creating. You'll want to make sure that you include headings to help us really understand the focus of the content that you're working on. So they do add a valuable part of delineating the different content. And as you can see here, this is an example of what I was speaking of earlier. Your heading font is typically sans serif, and your text font should be serif in a printed desktop publishing document. Column width, if you're justifying, what this is doing is explaining that you want a column width of 39 characters. That gives you a basic understanding of the width. Essentially, you would not do an entire page justified, basically. So if you're using justified font that is within columns, and I can promise you I would never count the number of characters, but this gives you an idea of where the size of the page and the size of the column that should be used if you are justifying content. Kind of think about it as perhaps an inset paragraph that may be used to better define a picture that you're showing or something to that extent. That is when you could justify the content, but it would not be used on a full page. All right. Display font should be 18 point or greater, and that is the heading and subheadings that you'll be using in sans serif format. and it's used to capture the reader's attention, conveying the main message within the content below. Initial caps can be used. It's a nice way to sort of bring your eye to that specific section, and they can be used. It does look very nice and professional as you add those different variations to your desktop publishing piece. When you're using headings, you do not include a space between the heading and the paragraph text below. So make sure that you have those set up so that there is no space, between here and here, okay? Use numbers, letters, or symbols for bullets. Essentially what this is doing is stating that you do not want to use asterisks or dashes. Use the pre-formatted option to create those lists within our desktop publishing software and apps that we do have available. And obviously, you're not going to mix the symbols. Have them all the same so that it looks much more professional. The other aspect, you want to make sure that this is left aligned. Your lists would never be center aligned. It creates quite a distraction for the eyes in the center alignment. So as you're going into then creating the page itself, it's important to look at what type of dominant elements we're having on a page. And you want to make sure as you're creating this, you've got a basic border, you've got all of this content left aligned, and we'll look at these slide by slide. And then you really only want to have one dominant object that draws your eye, that pulls you in, but it keeps it simplified. As I already stated, we're using alignment, so make sure that you have everything, and this is where your tabs can come in handy to make sure that it is readily aligned well. Make sure that you use appropriate grouping, so you're thinking about the content that you're putting on and having it clearly defined and separated from the rest. If you're looking at using contrast between the elements and the background, it's important to determine first and foremost what you're showing and what colors you're using. But one thing I want to emphasize here for us as learning professionals is accessibility. When we go further into the different classes, we'll discuss accessibility throughout the program. And the primary thing that is most important is making sure that all people can access the information. As I look at this poster on the right, I can guarantee you that people who are colorblind will absolutely struggle to read this font. So you would never want to put red and greens together specifically. And when you're doing contrast elements, please make sure that your background is a darker shade and your foreground font is definitely distinguished from that. But from an accessibility standpoint, colorblind, primarily red and green, on occasion blue, but make sure that you think about those things as you're putting the colors together. White space, obviously you want to not have your pages be too busy. You're far better off, especially when you get into your desktop publishing learning theories assignment, to have more pages than to have too full of a page. You also want to make sure that you have your borders so that the elements are not too close to the edge. Make sure you use your size of font appropriately here. You don't need distracting borders. They simply are not necessary. You want the eye drawn to the content and the timing. You would also not do this. Obviously, we've talked about only having one major element, so you would not have those other elements like this around the corners either. It's just too distracting. It pulls your eye away from the main content of the information. Images in the middle of the text, I would recommend staying away from that. You can have font around images, but don't keep it either left or right aligned of the text and not smack dab in the center of the text itself. Okay? And obviously, this just speaks for itself. Don't mix alignment. Don't if you're going to center font, center all of it, or left align all of it. But you would not do something to this extent. It's just too confusing for the eyes. Okay, so quick little quiz. There is no difference between portrait and landscape printing. We know that's false because we have the two different types of layout, our portrait and landscape layouts. And those are important to think about as you create your design and as you're creating your document. Think about how you want the eye drawn and how much information you want to be able to put on one page. This carries into your learning theory paper document as well. It becomes a book, and I've seen quite often students use landscape for that, and they use it very successfully. Portrait also works. I think it tends to become a personal preference. Use as many fonts as possible to keep the reader's attention. Our second question here obviously is false. It just looks ridiculous. Italics and bold instead of underline, outline, or shadow. That is very true. Obviously, because this may become an online document, we would not use underline because that does tend to still be used to indicate web links. Outline and shadow are simply too difficult to read in printed font and specifically online. So italics and bold are our best option, but we again will use those very sparingly. Serif and sans serif, you know these. Serif has the little feet and sans serif is smooth. And I just, Times Roman, Arial. Those are the easy ways. And for each document, really only use about 2 different fonts and stick with the same. Once you have chosen a specific type of serif font, stay with that throughout, and the same story with sans serif. And again, as I mentioned earlier, although you care for these 2 assignments that are coming, Project 1 and Project 2, this is also something you can integrate into the classroom. Students could create a book and self-publish in Amazon, or you can have them create infographics or desktop publishing pages for explaining and providing information for assignments. So create space, just to pull that up to show you the Amazon direct publishing options. And that wraps up the information that we will be needing for our desktop publishing assignments. Any questions? Always, I'm available by email, and I'm more than happy to answer anything you might have come up with. So have a great day and happy publishing.